remotely. We are honored to have Mr. Dmytro Natalukha, Chair of the Committee on Economic Development of the Ukrainian Parliament, Dr. Benjamin Moll, macroeconomics professor of London School at the London School of Economics, Mrs. Maíra Martini, research and policy expert of Transparency International, and Dr. Hannes Swoboda, president of the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies, and Dr. Timofey Milovanov, director of the Kyiv School of Economics. Yes, and so on behalf of the Econ Committee, I want to thank in particular our Ukrainian speakers, Mr. Natalukha and Dr. Milovanov, for meeting us today. The purpose of our meeting is to have an exchange of views on the economic impact of restrictive measures against Russia in response to its brutal aggression against Ukraine and its people. The EU has adopted the most far-reaching and hard-hitting sanction package ever to date in 8 successive packages aimed at further intensifying the pressure on Russia to end the war. The most recent, the 8th sanction package, was adopted by the Council on October the 6th. Indeed, economic and individual sanctions, as well as trade embargoes, have a tremendous impact on economic growth and inflation in Russia and the EU as well. As sanctions have been gradually introduced over the last 8 months, a better understanding of the economic situation and the expected economic impact, in particular on Russia, is of key importance, even though it's not that easy to do so when we are lacking relevant data and reliable data on these indicators. Assessing the economic impact of sanctions is also warranted in order to ensure their effectiveness and preventing potential circumventions. In Econ's field of competence, the war in Ukraine reinforced the call for action in a number of areas that has already been identified. Effects and specific actions concern both the area of legislation and the scrutiny and accountability. A few important practical considerations before we start. The hearing will be held in a format to enable dynamic exchange to the extent that it's possible, given that our speakers are remotely connected. But we will adopt this format. So we will start with the presentations by our invited speakers of 5 minutes each. And then the presentations will be followed by a first block of 4 questions, 2 minutes for each question and 3 minutes for each of the 5 answers. And then a second block of 4 questions, 2 minutes for each question and 3 minutes for each answer. And then a third block of 4 questions, again, 2 minutes for the question and 3 minutes for the answers. And then if time allows, additional slots will be allocated on a catch-the-eye basis. Now, I know that Mr. Dmytro Natalukha is, as you can imagine, connecting in a very difficult situations and conditions. So he's connecting with a mobile, but the connection is not very good. Of course, we can all understand the difficult situations, and we appreciate the fact that he still agreed in being with us this morning. Probably there will be no image or low-quality image, so it's probably we will not have translations. It will not be possible to do that, but I think he will have his intervention in English, so I think most of us will have no problems in following. So I don't know if yes, I see Mr. Natalukha connected. Mr. Natalukha, can you hear us?
Yes. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Thank you for this opportunity. And I'm terribly sorry for the connection, for the absence of video. I would love to see you all and to exchange in a more usual way, seeing each other. But nevertheless, I think that we can proceed quite fine without it, and then have an opportunity to meet each other a bit later.
We
hopefully.
hope the same.
Thank you very much again. I think that what we are witnessing throughout this 9 months has been an unprecedented act of unity, of a compassionate behavior, absolutely by all of the member countries. And I thank you all and the EU in general for assisting us so much in what regards not just the sanctions, but all kind of support, military, financial, humanitarian, and else. This is very much appreciated, trust me. And on behalf of every Ukrainian, I just wanted to say thank you. The sanctions
Mr. Natalukha, we can't hear you right now. So let's see if we can re-establish the connection. Is there a problem with the connection, I suppose? No?
No. Can you hear me again?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, sorry. Yeah, so the expectations from the very beginning were, of course, incredibly high. I think the IMF and the World Bank were literally predicting the worst recession in Russian history. In March and in April, the signals were pretty right. We have seen an inflation in Russia peaking up to 16% in March. I think up to 18, more than 18 probably in April, and it forced the Russian National Bank to increase the rates by up to 20%, trying to curtail the inflation. We have introduced a number of critical measures, starting with the financial measures and ending up with the physical bans on technologies, productions, raw materials, and so on and so forth. And I think that, in my personal opinion, what is going on right now is that we managed to put as much pressure as possible on Russia, but it did unpredictably.
Mr. Natalukha, we lost you.
Can you hear me well?
Yes, now yes.
Oh, sorry. So I was saying that Russia did better than expected by everyone. And right now that we see that there is still a lot of things to be done in the potential ninth package that we all expect to be enabled as soon as possible. I'm personally working on the case, for example, of the transportation of the Russian oil by the Greek companies, and this is a rather paramount aspect of the sanctions, because it still furnishes and pumps the Russian economy and military war machine with money. We are seeing a great. We didn't see any impact on the export of diamonds, for instance, as a sector in general. They have been using loopholes to export those minerals, and which is another great source of income. I'm terribly sorry, because when I speak from the phone, I cannot open any other document. I had a document prepared with all the data, but when I open it, the connection is lost. I just tried to do it, so I have to keep everything in my mind. So that is why you can hear me from time to time. But hello, sorry. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. So I was saying that Russia is still using loopholes in specific and in rather profitable sectors of its economy. And our task will be to try to target those sectors and those loopholes with new approaches. What kind of new approaches might be used, and how can we put even more pressure on Russia using a new objects of potential sanctions? Right now, we are considering sanctioning the political parties in Russia as institutions. So not just some top officials or some party officials, but parties in general. Those parties who have voted for this war back in February, who have enabled it and who have allowed Putin to introduce his army on the territory of Ukraine, and not just in 2022, but even before that, in the situation with Georgia, and even in the situation with Moldova and Transnistria. So every time Russia started the war somewhere, the Russian Duma was sitting there voting unanimously to allow Putin to introduce the army.
Mr. Natalukha, we lost you again.
Now?
Yes.
Yes, sorry. What would that give us? We're talking about targeting more than 4 million of people in Russia who are members of those parties, who are basically the backbone of the regime, because in Russia it's pretty much like in the old Soviet Union. You cannot succeed in your career if you're not a party member. So when we are saying members of the party, we are saying directors and principals of schools. We are saying about directors of universities. We are saying about chair people of state-owned enterprises. All those people who secure the establishment of this regime once it comes to the voting process, to elections. They are there to make sure that the parents of the children vote for the right candidate, that the students who protest are duly isolated, that the employers at the state-owned enterprises support the specific candidates, and so on and so forth, but they haven't been targeted by the sanctions until today. If we manage to target specifically the parties, I think that this will be a breakthrough in sanctions. In fact, that this might be one of the biggest sanctions in history. Not only because of that, but also because members of United Russia are very famous people, starting from businessmen, ending with sportsmen, artists, and so on and so forth, who are well known and who own a lot of assets outside of Russia. So if you take Arshavin, for instance, he's a football player who used to play for Arsenal. He owns 2 estates worth 26 million pounds on the territory of London. And he is a member of the United Russia. Now, if, for instance, United Russia is banned, then we could argue that the government of the UK might seize those assets or at least arrest them. And this is just one person. And imagine how many people there are outside just like him. That is also an interesting implication of a potential visa ban. Because recognizing United Russia, the Communist Party of Russia, LDPR, and other parties as organizations that facilitate terrorism will require those Russians who are entering the territory of the EU to probably mention that they are members of such organizations. The European Commission has such practice. I think throughout history it has recognized more than 34 organizations and political parties as organizations that facilitate terrorism. We're talking about Hamas, we're talking about Hezbollah,
Mr. Natalukha? Hello?
Hello?
Yeah, now we hear you. Sorry.
Yeah. So, okay, I will sum up. Sorry, because I don't want to take your time, given the connection is really poor. To sum up, I think that we need a breakthrough in the next package of sanctions, in the 9th package of sanctions, and sanctioning the political parties might wreak a lot of havoc in Russia and be that kind of the breakthrough. Because if you think about it, it will target more people that we managed to target in the previous 8 sanctions, and it will target the personal assets outside of Russia. It will target their ability to interact with the European banking financial institutions, with chain hotels, with airlines, and so on and so forth. And that will put an incredible pressure on the Russian political regime. And I just wanted to remind you that there has been a resolution in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe passed just last month, which recognized the responsibility of Russian political parties for this war and for the consequences of this war. So the take would be to kindly ask the partners to support this approach and to start considering recognizing Russian political parties as organizations that facilitate terrorism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Natalukha. I hope you can stay connected and I was thinking if you could send us the resolution that you just mentioned. I think it would be of interest for us to look at it. Now let's move on to the next speaker. Now I give the floor to Dr. Benjamin Moll, macroeconomics professor at the London School of Economics. Mr. Moll, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Good morning. It's an honor to be here. Can you see my slides? I have some slides.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Excellent. So I'm going to mostly complement what Dmytro was talking about, and I'm going to speak about the effect of sanctions on the EU economy, so not on Russia, and importantly, not just the effect of sanctions, but also sort of the sort of, I think it's fair to say, economic war, and in particular the energy war that Russia has been waging in return. Next slide, please. So the main message of my introductory presentation here is basically this one here on the slide. So, you know, I'm going to say the situation is serious. The economic costs of the energy war are real. The one that's particularly serious is the gas cutoff, and particularly for some countries. I'll come back to this. But I think it's very important to emphasize that everything we've seen so far in the data and all the predictions are essentially that the EU economy is withstanding and adapting in the face of this energy war. And it's really, I'm going to sort of argue, the price mechanism doing its job. So these prices are rising and people and firms are adapting in the face of these rising prices. Shortages and rationing are looking increasingly unlikely at this point. As a result, we sort of do expect recessions in some member countries, but really sort of mild ones, and also same for the EU economy as a whole. In this presentation, I'm going to speak about, I'm going to focus on one particular country that I think is a nice case study, but it's sort of representative of the wider EU economy. The reason I'm going to speak about that, it's my home country, and it's a country I've worked on a lot. And also, it was particularly reliant on Russian energy imports before the start of the war. For example, this is sort of a striking number. Russia supplied 55%, so more than half of all natural gas consumption before the start of the war. Next slide, please. So in a sense, what my presentation is about is this photograph here. So this is, I'm sure you've all seen this, Nord Stream 1 blowing up. So that gas is not flowing anymore. And so the question is, how does an economy adapt to this kind of a shock, and what have we seen so far, and what's still going to come? Next slide. And what we've seen, and I'll show you this in more detail later, is very substantial drops in gas consumption by both firms and households. These are some charts to show you this. This is published each week by the German network regulator. They're doing a very good job in data provision. And the way to read this is on the left is gas consumption by industry. On the right is gas consumption by households. These sort of the solid line, the solid sort of dark gray line with the dark shaded area around it, the gray shaded area around it is the average of gas consumption in previous years. And then the orange bars are gas consumption this year. And on the x-axis, I should have said, is calendar weeks. Okay, so this is sort of throughout the year gas consumption. And the reason why it's sort of a U-shape is because there's this strong seasonality where in the winter people heat more and consume more gas. And so if you look at this, you see already very large drops in gas consumption, larger than a lot of people thought were possible before the war. So, for example, industry right now is consuming 25% less gas than normal. Overall, it's sort of 37% less than normal. And for households, I'm going to come back to this. It's kind of too early to tell because it's only the start of the heating season now. But I mean, it's sort of looking quite encouraging. In particular, you can see there these last orange bars there are kind of only half of what the normal bars are. Part of this is the warm temperature. I'll come back to this, but you know, this is starting to look good. So large drops in gas consumption. Next slide, please. If you think back maybe to the debates at the beginning of the war, where you know, there was a lot of debates. Should we go for a EU-wide energy embargo, say also on gas? There was always this talk about cascading effects. This has not been mentioned so much recently. So the worry was also always that you'd have this the stop of energy imports from Russia, so in particular gas, and then you get these sort of domino effects whereby everything sort of breaks down along the supply chains. The graph here is just sort of what a modern economy looks like. This is sort of a network with many interconnections, and you can sort of see in principle if something breaks down, it could be bad. Important benchmark to keep in mind is if there was no adaptation of the economy to the shock or no substitution in economic parlance, then essentially what you would expect is that total production would drop 1-for-1 with gas usage. So even though gas is kind of this small input in production, it'd be this bottleneck. And so then if gas drops by 25%, you'd expect industrial production to drop by 25%. So for each percentage point gas drop, there would be a percentage point drop in production and then also GDP. So what I just wanted to show you, next slide, please, is what we've seen so far. The point of this graph here is this is data up until the end of September that just was released yesterday. We've seen only very small drops in industrial production, so it looks nothing like this no adaptation benchmark. So the blue line here is industrial production, and that's the thing to look at. And you can see there's a big drop there right in the middle of 2020. That's the COVID pandemic. But then after that, it's sort of pretty flat, and in particular in recent months, it's pretty flat. It's maybe down 1 or 2%, but nothing like you know, this 1-for-1 drop. If you do look in energy-intensive sectors, you do see larger drops, like chemicals and so on. But this is not sort of creating these domino effects along the supply chain. And similarly, predictions of what's going to happen are very much in line with this if you look at the research institutes. Okay, next slide, please. How is this happening? I've already said this. Essentially, adaptation or substitution along the supply chain. If you're interested in this, there's a paper on my website called How It Can Be Done that we wrote in July. We also wrote another paper back in March where we collected these kind of examples. I'll give you just one because it's sort of useful. So BASF, the big German chemicals manufacturer, they're producing ammonia. Ammonia is produced, gas is used very heavily in ammonia production, and then ammonia is used to produce fertilizer, for example. So what's been happening, for example, is that BASF, rather than producing the ammonia in their big plant in Ludwigshafen in Germany, is now producing the ammonia in their other plant in the United States. where gas prices are much lower, and then they're shipping the ammonia to Germany. Now, that obviously costs some jobs in Germany, in particular those involved in ammonia production, but it sort of kills these cascading effects whereby everything else breaks down. Okay, there's other examples I don't have time to talk about. Next slide, please. Now let me turn to households. Again, this is still about gas. I've already said this. So for households, I think it's sort of a bit too early to tell, because over the summer, gas consumption is traditionally very low. You can see this very nicely here in this graph. And now the key thing is going to be what's going to happen during the heating period. And we're not quite there yet. But again, if you compare the sort of orange bars here, which is this year's consumption, to the sort of gray line there, which is the average of previous year's consumption, you can see there's a very large reduction already. Part of this is the warm weather, but you can control for that, and the effect is still there. Next slide, please. Just to give you a sense of what I think is going to be really important, what to focus on or what to look out for going forward, what's going to be the main determinant of the economic costs. I think it's basically going to be what's going to, how those lines on the previous slide are going to look like going forward. So what's going to happen with household gas demand. And essentially, it's going to be really critical that these orange bars stay below the gray line, so that demand will be reduced relative to previous years. At the same time, these super high energy prices, so gas and other prices, are really problematic for some households, especially economically weaker ones. And it's really crucial to support these households in the face of these high energy prices. The key thing, though, is how to do this in a way to not reduce incentives for reducing gas demand. There's sort of blunt ways of doing this, which is to just cap gas prices, say. Like I live in the UK, this is how it's been done here. From the point of an economist, that's bad economic policy. What you should do instead is give people transfers that are not directly tied to energy consumption and that preserve incentives for reducing gas demand. In Germany, where I've been involved in the debate, and a lot of my colleagues have been as well, there's actually a very promising proposal to do this by, they put together sort of an expert commission. I'm happy to talk about this later in the Q&A. Next slide. The key thing, the key other thing is that if we manage to reduce demand, then this will also have another important effect, which is that prices are going to fall. So this is sort of a doubly good thing. This is gas prices, for example, and you can see, I mean, it's already kind of happening right now. So this is gas prices throughout the year 2022. This is futures prices, I should have said. They skyrocketed a lot just before the Nord Stream 1 shutdown in the beginning of September, end of August. They reached this really high peak there at 350, but ever since they've been coming down. That's primarily due to demand reduction, basically working as expected. Next slide, please, and that's my final slide. So the conclusion is, I think it's very important to emphasize that the EU economy is withstanding and adapting. To a certain extent, this is sort of economics 101. So the key driver here is just the price mechanism doing its job and resulting in falling demand and people substituting and adapting. An important aside that I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A as well, full gas storages in and of themselves are not enough to get through the winter. You really need this demand reduction. And really, one reason why the gas storage is full is the demand reduction. And just looking at the gas storage and saying, celebrating when they reach 95 or 100% is a bit of a distraction. I'm happy to talk about this later. Again, demand reduction by households will be critical. And what you want to do is alleviate hardships, but without destroying incentives. I'm going to stop there. Didn't say anything about the effects of the sanctions on the Russian economy. I did want to say one thing just to compliment Dmytro. I think I agreed with most of what he said. Sometimes you hear people saying the sanctions aren't working. I just wanted to say, and I'm happy to talk about this more later, I think they're very much working. If they're not having the effect as some people were hoping on the Russian economy, then that's because there's holes in the sanctions and that need to be plugged and need to be the sanctions need to be toughened. Okay, I'm going to stop there.
Thank you. We are a little bit over time, but let's move swiftly to the next speaker. I give the floor to Maíra Martini from Transparency International.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Good. Thanks a lot for the invitation, and congratulations also for organizing this important discussion. I think I will take us in a bit of a different direction. I wanted to talk a little bit more about individual target sanctions, and in particular focusing on some of the challenges that we see countries are facing to implement it effectively. And the latest information we have is that the European Union member states have frozen 14.5 billion euros in assets belonging to oligarchs and entities connected to them that have been designated. However, 19% of the amount frozen comes from only 6 member states: Austria, Belgium, Germany, Luxembourg, Ireland, and France. And altogether, the remaining 21 member states only accounted for 10% of the frozen assets. So, of course, it's plausible that certain countries may have more assets connected to Russians, but nevertheless, I think the numbers call for their analysis to understand what might be behind this. What we know is that across the different countries, across member states, authorities have been trying to identify and trace assets, but really with their hands tied behind their back. And I want to discuss some of these challenges that we are seeing in the different work we have been doing with authorities and with civil society in different member states. So historically, I think one of the main issues is that there is a strong reliance on obliged entities to implement sanctions. So banks, but also real estate agents, accountants, lawyers, so those that have anti-money laundering obligations. And I think this is particularly problematic when we're talking about the non-financial sector. So designated non-financial business and professionals, because they might not have a very good understanding of money laundering risks. And also because we have seen a lot of challenge related to their effective supervision in the past. And several scandals in the last years have shown that those obliged entities were really failing to understand, to undertake adequate due diligence. And often they didn't even record adequate information on their customers, on the beneficial owners, and so on and so forth. And what we know is that oligarchs, kleptocrats, corrupt individuals, and particularly those who are likely to be targeted by sanctions, do not own assets on their own name. So they use anonymous companies, they use complex structures, and they use nominees. Sometimes the nominees are even the same entity that now is required to implement the sanction, or the same profession. So there is definitely a challenge there. So freezing and seizing assets will require investigative work. We cannot take the list of designated individuals and expect that we can easily find assets connected to those. So the main challenge we see here is that, one, authorities often do not have the necessary resource, and I'm talking about staff, financial and technical resource. A recent analysis we did show that in some countries, each staff of financial intelligence unit is expected to review thousands of suspicious transaction reports on their own, in addition to conducting other tasks. And the second challenge is that even the most willing authorities may not even have access to data to carry out investigations, because data is not available or not collected. For example, for most type of assets, such as real estate, yachts, jets, and also investment funds, there is no information on the real individuals behind them available to authorities. And for company ownership data, we know that The existence of public beneficial ownership registers across the EU put member states in a really privileged position, because this information is already helping authorities, also in other countries, to identify potential assets connected to designated individuals. But also steps should be taken to close remaining loopholes. So improve the quality of the data, ensure direct and unfiltered API access, at least to all relevant competent authorities, which is not the case at the moment. In some countries, law enforcement authorities cannot even access this database directly, although they already exist and are there. And before concluding, I also wanted to point out to a contradiction in the sanctions regime, which is related to the prohibition of the provision of trust service to all Russians. So this is in place from July 2022. Trust service providers cannot offer trust service to Russians, all Russians, not only to designated individuals. The provision also instructs trust service to dissolve and return assets to the owners, and if they are sanctioned, the assets need to be frozen. But there is a very curious exemption to this rule, which is made for dual Russian EU citizens. So those that have a European passport or hold a residence permit in the EU are allowed to retain their trusts across the bloc. With everything we know on golden visas and passports, and the Commission's own recommendations in relation to Russian nationals benefiting from these schemes, this exemption raises serious questions, and I think adds here another loophole to the sanctions regime. And finally, I think many of the challenges we see now can be addressed in discussions that are ongoing in the EU Parliament at the moment, like the anti-money laundering package, but also other proposals. We hope this horrible event will serve as a lesson, and that the systemic issues that have allowed Russia and Putin to gain and sustain so much power are now weaken the implementation of sanctions will be finally addressed, so we prevent also similar abuse in the future. And just one final remark, I think connected to what Mr. Natalukha was suggesting of the approach of sanctions. We have been defending also from the beginning of the invasion that asset tracing efforts should be expanded to the Russian political elite, so going beyond oligarchs. We believe there is a really powerful class of officials working at the federal administration in Russia who are really important to implement policies in Russia, but also to keep those that are contrary to the government in check. And we feel that, and they also very likely to hold assets abroad. There have been also denounced of their involvement in corruption and so on. So targeting those could help also increase pressure inside the country. I'll stop here and happy to go back to any of the points I mentioned during the Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to Dr. Hannes Swoboda, President of the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies. Dr. Swoboda, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody, and I'm happy to be back in the Parliament, even if only digital. I speak on behalf of the Vienna Institute, and the Vienna Institute is focusing especially on the eastern part of Europe, from the Baltics down to the Western Balkans. Now, of course, it's difficult to speak about the effects of sanctions because the sanctions are always intertwined with counter-actions, counter-sanctions, with many other economic developments. But let me concentrate on some issues. Concerning Russia, much has been said. It is clear that our expectation has been exaggerated. We had to change our forecasts, and Russia is doing much better than was foreseen. Basically, it is because of internal measures by Russia itself, but also because Russia could import goods which were in some sort of a parallel importation from other countries when they didn't get the goods from Europe or from the United States. But most importantly, it's not the sanctions directly, but the withdrawal of many companies, European and Western companies, who did not longer want to be part of the Russian economy. With that withdrawal, they withdraw also the new technologies they have been implementing in the country. So that is the major point. All the other issues are important psychologically, politically, but important is that Russia is deprived as long as it has this policy from new technologies. And therefore, it's very important to control that these new technologies are not imported by somebody else. China, Turkey, will come to that a bit later. So this is the major issue. And of course, it's very clear that the second most important effect is that qualified young men and women leave the country. Therefore, whatever we do, we should be very open-minded concerning also that these people can leave Russia, because these are the people who would otherwise contribute to the technological development. Of course, they leave not only because of political reasons, they leave because they don't want to be part of the war, which is also important. So I think whatever we do against people, it is clear that these people should be not targeted by sanctions, but should be invited to leave the country and to reduce the economic potential of the country. Now, coming to Ukraine, I just want to mention that until now, Ukraine did very well, much better also than expected in a positive sense. But of course, we have to be careful about any forecast now when Russia is destructing so much of the infrastructure. And therefore, again, we have to make it very clear that every country which is supporting Russia in that war, including drones from Iran and so on, should be targeted also from our side, because it's not only about sanctioning Russia, but it's also to really get a close focus on those countries who help Russia to win the war. And here I come to Turkey. Now, we know that Turkey is not following the sanctions regime. Turkey is in some way a place, at least, where some of the trade is going and is increasing towards Russia. Now, I know it's a critical issue because Turkey is also helping Ukraine in some way on the grain export issue, for example. So it is not easy just to target Turkey and say you do only a bad job when it helps us in some way, Ukraine. But we should be very careful that at least not modern technology is exporting via Turkey into Russia. Now, as I said, the Institute is focusing especially also on southeastern Europe. Here we find, of course, a very different situation. What has been mentioned already in the second talk, I think we have to look to the poorer part of the society, how they are affected. And that is especially true, of course, for the Balkan countries, where we have rising inflation, as in all the countries, especially rising food prices, which is, again, affecting people. So it's not only energy as such, but the consequences of high energy on food prices. And those countries and those people who spend more in percentage of their income and their expenditure on food, of course, are much more affected from the Western Balkans, but also Hungary, Slovakia. So some of the countries have a heavy burden. Secondly, of course, as I said, the energy prices. Thirdly, high interest rates. We have high interest rates in many of the countries which are affecting the housing markets, and of course, poor people to get to houses. And that in addition to higher housing expenses when we think about energy and for the electricity and gas prices. Then, of course, high interest rates also prevent countries, governments and private companies to get the credits. And for the governments, it's the problem of compensating. So the poorer countries cannot compensate like some of the richer countries inside the European Union. They are poorer people for higher prices. So this is an important element. And then, of course, any recession in Germany or some other countries have their effects in smaller countries who are very much dependent on export to these countries. So let me come only to one country specifically, and that is Serbia. We know that Serbia is also not following the sanctions. until now, we don't see much increase in trade between Serbia and Russia, which could be also a loophole. But we have to be very careful. I know the Commission President has been recently in Serbia, but we have to be very careful that Serbia is not a gate and a loophole for transporting special goods, technologies, and so on to Russia. So I think this is the very important elements that we have to look into it, that these loopholes, I spoke about Turkey, about Serbia, but many other countries are not used. My final remark, of course, is going on the energy price again. Yes, there should be an incentive for saving energy, and it's working in some way, but we should be very careful that the high energy prices don't lead to some deindustrialization in Europe. We see already that what the United States is doing with strong support for their industry. And if Europe is not very careful, then we have the danger that some of our good industries moving out of Europe, moving to the US, moving to Asia. So I think in connection with the sanctions, we should look really in the job losses possible in Europe because of industry moving out of Europe because of the high prices. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now we have Dr. Timofey Milovanov. I saw he was connected. Don't know if he's still connected. I know that the Secretariat was testing his connection. Yes, I see him. Good morning, Mr. Milovanov. Thank you. Thank you very much for being with us this morning. Can you hear us? No.
Okay.
Hello?
Sir, just press once on the speak button, please. Sir, just once, please.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I just got connected, so I didn't hear the prompt. How long can I speak for, or should I speak for?
Oh, you have 5 minutes, but if you
No, it's okay.
need a couple of minutes more. Yeah, thank you. Really appreciate your being with us this morning. Thank you.
All right. So my job is to describe the situation with the economy in Ukraine. And I'm happy to comment on other economic-related issues. Please correct me if I'm wrong about, or if I deviate in terms of focus and you want something else. On the economy, sometime in the summer, we have been getting essentially pretty bullish reports that the economy has adapted as a result of the war. Of course, we're going to lose about 30 to 40% of GDP relative to the previous year, but then we thought that the situation in Ukraine is coming to some kind of steady state. However, the most recent attacks on the energy infrastructure have affected our ability to provide electricity and more recently water and waste management to the largest cities, As a result, the government electricity regulator has imposed sufficient restrictions on the electricity consumption, including by the industry. Multiple companies have been reduced their quotas by 30% or more. That means that there will be further reductions in the ability to produce goods, and GDP is likely to fall further. While there is no precise estimate or forecast yet, we can see some of this reflected in the budget, which has been just passed by the Parliament of Ukraine. There was a revised forecast. There was an optimistic growth in the fear of several percent, of 4% growth in the first forecast. Now they revised it down to 1.5. Further, they have revised more optimistically inflation, which means basically that the economy production will be suffering. The damages, there is no precise assessment of the recent infrastructure damages, but they probably run in tens of billions of dollars. And the situation is a little bit more difficult than tends to be reflected in the media. For example, in Kyiv, as of yesterday, some of apartments, and that's typical, had only several hours of electricity a day. So that's gonna negatively affect the economy. But fundamentally, the economy during the wartime economy in Ukraine is very simple. You don't have any investment. The private consumption has gone down significantly, maybe times. Maybe it was 1/3 of what it was before the war. And the government expenditures on social support, on infrastructure support, and on military have increased. This means that a substantive part of GDP, actually about 20% of GDP in the next year, is going to be the military expenditures. The government faces a $38 billion budget deficit, but I think this number is optimistic. We probably will be facing by the mid of the next year, the annual budget deficit of maybe $50 billion. That's Kyiv School of Economics assessment, but that disagrees with the assessment with the current forecast of the government. So the government is asking for about $3 billion support annually, but I think our numbers are more consistent with what the IMF is putting forward, is about $5 billion a month. That's what will be the forecasted need according to our estimation. Because we run a little bit more pessimistic scenarios on infrastructure damages, we think Russia will continue to target critical infrastructure in Ukraine. The current damage assessment, overall direct damages, are at $127 billion. This is the latest Kyiv School of Economics estimate of September. They do not include the October energy assessments, critical infrastructure damages. Those are likely to stay classified and probably won't be released for a while. But I think, again, they are tens of billions of dollars. And I think I'm out of time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Now, of course, as we open the floor for questions, if MEPs have additional questions to Mr. Milovanov as well as to the other speakers, we will have the time to go in further details. So let's get started with the first round. We start with Ludek Niedermayer for EPP.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have three questions to our panelists. The first concerns the data on Germany, as was presented by our guest from LSI. I wonder to which extent you think that there is the risk that after the governments will implement different kinds of supportive protective measures, price caps, that the consumption will not continue to be lower. The second question, our guest from Transparency International talked about the freezing of private assets, and I guess there is not just one challenge that we talk about, so that means right identification, but there is also a second challenge, and this is how to use these assets. So I wonder if the speaker has any opinion. And last, to probably our guest, Ms. Swoboda from Vienna, I wonder how you put into the picture of the impact on the sanction, the role of the third countries. As you said, on one hand, there is the risk that they will undermine our, let's say, especially technological and military embargo. On the other hand, it's important that Russia keep exporting some goods to poor countries in order to allow them to have access to fertilizers or the food, but still, I guess we need to somehow control the financial revenues of the Russian state. So just to make it more simple, how you think that our policy should be oriented towards the third countries as concerned the embargo? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Jonas Fernandez for the S&D group. So we are collecting 4 questions in the first block, and then we have a first round of answers.
Gracias, Presidenta.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'll be speaking Spanish if that's okay. Well, first of all, I'd like to send a message of solidarity to Professor Milovanov. The European Parliament is standing by. The chairman interrupts.
From the platform, you can switch the language and have a translation, because sometimes people that are not used to our platform, they don't know. So please make sure that you can have a translation in English or in other languages. Thank you. Yeah, sorry, Jonas.
Otherwise, I can speak in English. But
no, I think if nobody complains or saying anything, I think you can go ahead.
Okay. Sí. Bueno, pues.
Well, first of all, I would like to salute Mr. and Dr. Milovanov. The European Parliament has stood by Ukraine and will continue standing next to Ukraine. And I'd also like to greet Dr. Swoboda, who also chaired my parliamentary group. I have 2 questions. The first one is more for Maíra Martini. It's on individual sanctions and whether they have worked or not. I'm referring to the individual sanctions that have gone through over the last few months and the fact that some European countries haven't been cooperating. I'm thinking of Switzerland in particular. The country has frozen €6 billion in assets, but we're talking about a lot more in Switzerland when it comes to Russian assets. So we feel that this is a loophole in the sanctions that maybe we need to revise, and I'd appreciate your opinion on them. Now, my second question is for Dr. Benjamin Moll from the LSE. You said that we need to have these price signals in order to make sure that we focus on the incentives when it comes to consumption of gas. So, and we also need to help more vulnerable households, but the situation is so critical that there's a lot of political pressure to help not only more vulnerable households, but the industrial fabric and the whole of society. There's huge pressure, and so I understand the universities are talking about price signals and having protection systems for the most vulnerable or from the most humble backgrounds. That is quite easy to handle politically, but I'd like to know whether you have any ideas on how we could implement these kind of measures. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Georgios Kyrtsos for Renew.
Thank you very much. Is there any assessment of the member states in the sense which are effective in imposing sanctions and which states avoid their responsibilities? For instance, my country, Greece, is very slow in decreasing its dependency on Russian gas, natural gas. And according to what I read in the international press, 50% of the Russian oil is transported by Greek vessels, since the Greek merchant fleet is huge. So, because one has to evaluate the performance of each member state in order to reach a common approach eventually. And the other thing is about the golden visa. Golden visas are applied in a large scale in Greece as well. So do you have any additional information on how they use Russian oligarchs and the Putin system in general could use golden visas to avoid sanctions? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Ernest Urtasun for the Greens.
Thank you so much. Let me first also express to Mr. Natalukha the support and sympathy on behalf of the Greens in the European Parliament, and thank him particularly for being here with us and also to the other speakers. My question goes a bit following what Jonas Fernandez said on the problems that we have with the sanction are very much linked also to the loopholes that we have in our EU legislation. This has been pointed by the representation of Transparency International and also with the interesting report they just published. And one of the things that is interesting for this Parliament now is actually how to fix some of those loopholes in our IML framework now that we are in the middle of the revision of the directive and the regulation. So I would like to ask our speakers, and particularly the representative of Transparency International, what are your views on what the EU should change to address those loopholes that would indeed effectively allow to track better Russian assets covered by sanctions? And particularly, I would like to know your opinion on the possibility, for instance, of setting up an asset registry at EU level. Firstly. Secondly, how do you think we should strengthen the beneficial ownership of companies, which I think is at the core of the problems we are having? And finally, how to address the issue of non-compliance by professional enablers, which I think is another big loophole that we have in our IML legislation. I would like to know your opinion about those three things. Thank you.
Okay, so we have now a round of answers. I think most of the questions were to all of the speakers, so we'll just go through them. In the meantime, Mr. Natalukha had to disconnect, but the other speakers can answer these questions. So let's start from Dr. Moll.
Okay. Yeah, two very good questions. So I'm going to answer jointly Mr. Niedermayer's and Mr. Fernandez's question because they're very related. So Mr. Niedermayer's question was, I'd shown these charts of gas demand dropping a lot in Germany, and the question was now if governments implement these supportive measures, sort of gas price caps and so on, do I expect this demand reduction to be less or disappear, which could then lead to shortages, I guess. So the answer, and then Mr. Fernandez's question was about industry. The answer to Mr. Niedermayer's question is, what's important is that, if the governments were indeed to implement sort of gas price caps, then I would indeed be worried. But the important thing is that at least in the case of Germany, the proposed policy and what they're most likely going to adopt is not actually a gas price cap. It's a little bit confusing because in the media and the words also the politicians use, they always say gas price brake or Gaspreisbremse in German, but the Commission's proposal is actually nothing like that. Instead, it's what economists call a lump sum transfer. So basically, people get a transfer that's linked to an estimate of their gas consumption, which is based on their last year's energy consumption. So in particular, if you save a lot of gas, so you reduce your gas consumption a lot, you still get to keep that transfer, which is very different from a price cap or a subsidy, where if you reduce your gas consumption, you lose the money. So here, instead, with the proposal of the Commission, for every extra kilowatt hour of gas a household saves, they save the entire market price, which is very high, and not just the sort of cap price. And this is really the sort of neat thing about this Commission's proposal. So hopefully the German government will adopt this, and then this is much better policy than the price cap. The worry that I have there is twofold. So first of all, in the case of Germany, the challenge is communicating this correctly. So if all people and firms think this is indeed a price cap, even though it's not, then I guess it's sort of going to backfire and not going to have the intended effect and to incentivize. So it's really important that politicians communicate this directly, and so far they're not doing that great a job, so there's lots of room for improvement. The second thing is similar policies in other countries. So in other countries, there are indeed a lot of countries that are actually just adopting or look like they're going to adopt these sort of brute force price caps, and then I'd be worried about the desired effect of on incentives and demand reduction. And then finally, turning to industry, so this was Mr. Fernandez's question. So what they've proposed in Germany is basically to adopt a very similar model for firms, where basically also firms get a transfer that's based on their previous year's energy consumption, and so just to help with the gas bill. So if you use more in the past, you get more money, but it's in such a way that the incentives for reducing gas demand are still preserved. So I think basically the same logic that I've explained for households you can use for industry, and that's good policy, and that should help with also the concerns about sort of deindustrialization that Mr. Swoboda raised. I'm going to stop there.
Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to Maíra Martini.
Thank you. Yeah, very interesting questions. Thanks a lot. Let me go through them. So the first question on how to use the assets that are now being frozen. This is key, because under a sanctions regime, you cannot confiscate assets, right? So that's why we have been saying that we need real accountability. So we need to go beyond the sanctions to really investigate the origin of the funds that were used to purchase the assets and go through the process to confiscate. And to do this in a timely manner, in a time that brings accountability as quick as possible, it's really important that member states have the legal tools to do that. So non-conviction-based forfeiture or unexplained wealth orders, or even sanctions evasion as a crime, because this would allow authorities to do investigations and pursue accountability and against the asset, not necessarily against the individual, which then has a lower burden of proof and a bit easier to achieve while still respecting due process and rule of law and so on. We know that there are discussions currently with the directive that has been proposed that would improve non-conviction-based forfeiture across the Union. And I think this is really, really important if we want to talk about being able to confiscate the assets and then use the funds. The other point was around cooperation by different countries in the implementation of sanctions. Switzerland was mentioned, but I think it's really important to highlight there have several other countries are quite resistant in implementing sanctions and could actually be supporting those trying to evade sanctions. We have seen recently news about Hong Kong in a yacht that was there. There have been a lot on the UAE and the role of Dubai, for example, in supporting sanctions evasion potentially. So I think it's really important here that the European Union try to coordinate with partners on proactively exchanging information. We know transnational case, very often you need information that is elsewhere to even be able to implement sanctions on your own country. So I think it would be very useful to try to do more in a proactive manner rather than just reacting to findings of specific investigations. There is this transatlantic task force, REPO, that has been created. We have been pushing for broadening the mandate of this task force, but also broadening participation. In Switzerland, I think it's a crucial country that should be part of those efforts. And on the assessment of the implementation of sanctions and what countries have been doing is something also that the European Union could do more in requesting countries to publish more information. Currently, we don't have a systematic way. Countries don't publish information regularly. So some countries like France will publish a list of frozen properties, for example, but this is not information that is systematically published by all countries, which makes it very difficult for us to assess what has been done and what has not been done. On golden visas, again, we at Transparency International have been highlighting the risks posed by golden visas, particularly because there is more than enough evidence that countries are not doing the needed checks before granting citizenship or residence to applicants. Russians have been among those that have, in many countries, applied for golden visas. We know through leaks that many of them have, with a shady background and shady source of fund, have been awarded golden visas. And now there is a debate on what needs to be done to either revoke the golden visa that has been awarded, or at least audit past awards. I think how it could be used here. In theory, when engaging with an obliged entity, for example, they should disclose all their nationalities. But in practice, what we see, and I have found myself in beneficial ownership registers, case where Russians have been reporting a different citizenship than the Russian one, thanks to golden visa, which makes the process for identifying potential assets a bit longer because it's not that straightforward. So it certainly makes it easier for them to open bank accounts or to engage with obliged entities across Europe without raising as much red flag as they would otherwise. And finally, on the question made by the Greens on the loopholes, and there were several questions there. So let me start with the asset register. The report we just published a couple of months ago called Up to the Task, one of the things we highlighted is how, in spite of countries across Europe having set up beneficial ownership registers, it's still possible to purchase assets remaining anonymous. That's because I can set up a company in another country that doesn't have a beneficial ownership register and come to a European country and invest in that country, so purchase either property or a luxury good, and then I don't need to register in the BO register. That's not the case everywhere, but in most countries. So there is a significant loophole there that is very easy to address. You should simply require that every single company investing in a member state needs to fulfill the same requirements of a domestic company, so needs to disclose their beneficial owner. So if they open a bank account, if they purchase a property, if they purchase another type of asset, they should be required to disclose their beneficial owner. This would bring us very close to an asset register, what we call a global asset register, because then we would have information and beneficial ownership information of the real owners of all types of assets in that specific country. Now, an asset register, to be really effective, should be connected. No? So ideally, authorities should be able to easily connect these different data sets and use that for investigation. Now, on measures to strengthen BO registers, is a long list, so I'll try to prioritize here. I think number one is the definition that is currently being used. The directive talks about the 25% threshold of ownership interest. What we have seen in different countries is that this threshold is really problematic depending on the types of legal entities we are talking about. If we're talking about investment funds, we're not going to know whose interest is there if we apply directly this threshold. So there needs to be a better understanding of the risks, and we need to look to lower this threshold depending on the type of legal entity we are talking about. The second thing is the coverage. So there are some types of legal entities that fall outside of the scope, and that's the ones that are being abused. So we saw, for example, in Ireland, a peak in the number of Irish limited partnerships that have been registered since the beneficial ownership started to be in place, because this type of company is not under the current rules to declare beneficial owner. So covering those loopholes are really, really important. And then finally, I think has to do with verification of the data. We need to resource, empower, and give the mandate to registry authorities to independently check the information that is in the register. So it's not so easy for those to put nominees or proxies instead of declaring the real beneficial owner. And finally, sorry, I know it's taking long, on the non-compliance by professional enablers, a crucial measure here is to improve supervision of non-professional enablers. We know that in many countries, supervision is currently left to professional associations. It's also sometimes you have more than one body in the country responsible for supervising, sometimes more than 10 of them for supervising one single type of profession. I think we need to have more coherence in this approach, and we need to have more control by a government agency that can check if their professionals and business are fulfilling their requirements, are reporting, understand the risks, and so on and so forth. So making sure that supervision is not left to the professional bodies themselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are a little bit over time. Let's see if we can recover. Dr. Swoboda.
To be very short on the question of Mr. Niedermayer, which is a very important one, I just would say, yes, we have to allow economic and trade by Russia if it helps to solve a very urgent issue, which is poverty and famine, and if it does not damage to Ukraine. So there's no specific rule where you can say yes or no, but I think it's always a political evaluation, and therefore we should do that. On technology, it's different, and I think it's not so much the export which is interesting, but the import to Russia should have control. What we need is, of course, more allies in our activities worldwide, and if we would prevent the fight against poverty and famine by preventing export of fertilizers and grain, then we will not win allies in our fight against the Russian aggression. So this is the one point. Very briefly, only to the price cap for industry and for consumers. I fully agree with Mr. Moll. We have to have both. You have to have support, necessary support for consumers and industry, but also incentives to save energy. If you don't do that, it can be very expensive. We see that the situation in Hungary is specifically critical on the economic side, because there is an overuse of just price cap and financing, so by the budget. And the last point on the golden visa, it's my personal opinion, because we had the debate for many years already when I was still member of the parliament. The golden visas are very often used for money laundering, even if not together with the sanctions. So we should have much more transparency on this issue and be rather very restrictive on the golden visas. But that's my personal opinion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to Mr. Milovanov. I hear that he couldn't hear Mrs. Fernandez's question, but his questions were mostly directed to Mr. Moll and Mrs. Martini, so I think there's no problem. Mr. Milovanov.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to speak. Actually, I want to follow up on the Ukrainian position, or at least our position with respect to sanctions on Russia and with respect to the consumption of energy in Europe. I think incentives are critical because Russia is using the dependence, the high consumption, to be able to create leverage. And so economic incentives to gradually but meaningfully reduce consumption are important to make Europe independent of Russian leverage in the future. So these price caps are worrisome for us and for me personally as an economist, because it does create certain perverse, incorrect incentives. On golden visas, I know the information from this side of the world, and they indeed often are considered to be a mechanism for, again, I also will say this is my personal opinion, but from talking to some intelligence that used to bring money for money laundering. And on sanctions and on effects, in particular on global south, I think we should not underestimate how Russia interacts and campaigns in global south and makes arguments that sanctions are counterproductive, which is completely incorrect because there are, of course, a lot of specific issues and hiccups with sanctions, and if the sanctions create humanitarian issues for other countries, they have to be addressed. But at the same time, it's critical to continue to deprive Russia from funding from the rest of the world and ban critical imports for them that they use for defense and for military, because Russia is now an authoritarian regime with an aggressive military power, and the purpose of sanctions is continue to create pressure on Russia to deny Russia from the ability to run aggressive military regime to the extent it is possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now let's have our second round of questions. I give the floor to Antonio Rinaldi, ID.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'd like to put a question to Dr. Benjamin Moll from the LSE. This is the question. Do you not think that the European Commission should have taken a preventive approach and carried out an impact assessment on the economic consequences on EU countries? I'm raising this problem because implementing the packages of sanctions haven't respected the principle of fair. They're not symmetrical. I'll give you a straightforward example. The fourth set of sanctions dating back to April accounts for certain exceptions for certain goods, €300 for fashion items, 750 for electronic appliances. For electronic appliances, €1,000. For musical instruments, 1,500, but €50,000 for vehicles. So these are manufacturers' prices. So then we're talking about twice as much when there's for retail prices because of transport and other things along the supply chain. 50,000 for a vehicle. I mean, so that basically means no sanctions when it comes to vehicles, and yet when it comes to fashion, it's a different situation. So my question is, there was a real lack of an impact assessment, so we have these random numbers without any criteria underpinning them. That was my first question. The second one is for Mr. Swoboda from the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies. Mr. Swoboda, do you not think that by using crypto assets, Russia is evading these sanctions? Don't you think that when it's crypto that the chains in the links in the chain are too long? Thank you.
Left.
Mr. Papadimouli. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I would like to thank all the speakers for their presentations and for their contributions to today's debate. My first question is for Dr. Moll, Mrs. Martini, and our former colleague, Dr. Swoboda. And this is for the second part of the title of the debate. In other words, what is the impact of the 8 sets of EU sanctions on the EU economies, or the EU economy and the member state economies? I felt that this part of the title wasn't really covered by the initial presentations, so the focus wasn't really on that. Sanctions are a double-edged knife. There will be a negative impact not only on the invader, Putin, but also will have an impact on the EU economies. Given the forecasts for 2023, in other words, that we have the threat of recession looming and the increase in disparities, given that, I'd like to know what your assessment is of the impact of these sanctions on the EU economy, and the member states. We also have indications that inequalities are increasing. My second question refers to evaluating or assessing to what extent EU member states are towing the line, are respecting the sanctions. And this ties in with what Mr. Kyrtsos said. There was a reference to Greek ship owners and the fact that they're transporting Russian oil, Russian petrol oil. So I would like to know what measures the speakers think should be adopted in order to better tackle this problem. Now, another question. You look at economic indicators, and that's what you measure. But are you also interested or concerned with the issue of how long these sanctions have to go on? There's the issue of a ceasefire, diplomacy, talks, and the restoration of peace, so that we can help Ukraine with their reconstruction, but also protect our economies from a deadly increase in debts and the advent of recession and more social inequalities. You look at economic models. Are these factors that you're including? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to Paul Tang for S&D.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to thank the speakers for their contributions for this very important topic. We've tried to make the sanctions work effectively. I will focus on the discussions that we also have in the European Parliament concerning beneficial owners. So I assume that my questions are mainly addressed to Ms. Marini, but if other speakers want to contribute to that, I'm happy to hear that. Because the problem is that ownership can be hidden behind a corporate veil, and the limited partnerships in Ireland is one of these examples, but trusts can also be one of those tools. And I was a bit saying that if we would unveil the corporate structure and see the beneficial owner, we would have a global asset register. And I find it a bit puzzling because I don't think we register ownership even from corporate side on many on different types of assets, including, for example, diamonds or works of art or crypto assets. If you want to have a global asset register, shouldn't they be this type of assets be included in the register? So we register the ownership of, like I said, diamonds, works of art, or crypto assets. And do you also see a shift towards it as a way to escape the sanctions? Is there a reaction, more generally, more broadly? Do you see attempts to avoid sanctions to areas which are unregulated at this stage?
Thank you, Paul. Now I give the floor to Engin Eroglu for Renew Group.
Ja, sehr geehrte Frau Vorsitzende, auch ich möchte mich herzlich...
Thank you. I'd also like to thank the speakers for their views. I'd like to concentrate on the sanctions. It's clear that we want to provide financial and military support to Ukraine, and also we're focusing on a war that's been going on since 2014 through the escalation by Putin, and we're looking at the costs on both sides. And we've heard from the speakers that the impression could be created that sanctions are not achieving their objective. And I think we need a better communications strategy from research, from the Parliament, making clear which sanctions are working and how and what the economic impact is. And that we need to continue to extend the sanctions, because I don't think that Putin is going to stop the war anytime soon. And so I think the question would be to the researchers that we have here. What do you think of the notification from Morgan Stanley that India will be more than doubling its GDP? And whether or not there would be a possibility for Russia to circumvent the sanctions going through India. And then the question would be who would be participating in the sanctions against Russia. And if the figures that we've got this morning from Morgan Stanley are correct, this is something we really have to look into. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to Margarida Marques for the S&D Group.
Muito obrigada, Presidente. Vou também falar português.
Thank you, Chair. Let me speak my native Portuguese. Like my colleagues, let me thank all panelists. We heard about all the different elements, and that's allowed for a lot of insight into the impact on the ground in Ukraine, but also in the EU and in third countries. I think this has been a very interesting debate, and I have several questions, 3 to be exact. The first is from Mr. Natalukha, who gave us an analysis of the relationship between the EU and Russia. And I have a specific question. What about dialogue? And how do we reach out to Russian civil society? Can we establish a dialogue with those who are critical of the political and military leadership in Russia at the present time? Second question. My second question might be answered by Mr. or Dr. Benjamin Moll. He said that there has been an impact in industrial production, a drop. It could lead to economic fallout, recession, joblessness. And Mr. Swoboda similarly spoke about the risk of relocation. Companies might be struggling in Europe. As a result, they may turn their attention to third countries to produce there instead. And of course, this affects employment levels. So my question, how do we deal with the economic and social fallout of sanctions in the EU? Because this social and economic impact needs to be responded to. We need to come up with the right measures to cushion that blow. If we don't do that, then we lose the trust and confidence of citizens in the strategy we're pursuing as the EU, as we support Ukraine. So this boils down to the following. How do we cushion the blow? The social, economic and political blow. Because we can't fail to cushion that economic and social blow. Then there's also the threat of anti-democratic values, those who aren't in line with EU values, the extreme right. They want to make the most of this current set of circumstances. They want to make the most of it to boost themselves. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Margherita. Now we have our round of answers, and as I mentioned earlier, Mr. Natalukha had to leave earlier, and so he's not connected anymore, but I will give the floor to Dr. Moll.
Great, thank you. So yeah, there were, if I kept track, questions by Mr. Rinaldi, Mr. Papadimoulis. I'm going to say something about what Mr. Eroglu said and Ms. Marquez. So, Mr. Rinaldi, your question, I couldn't quite catch everything because of the simultaneous translation. If I understood correctly, the question was about should there have been an impact assessment of the sanctions. In particular, I think you were talking about the sanctions on exports of the European Union to Russia, so Russian imports, and why the different restrictions, where they came from. I'm not quite sure how these particular numbers were reached. I do think there were, I mean, at a broader level, plenty of assessments, maybe not by the European Commission or European Union, but I mean by independent research organizations and so on. So, I mean, my sense was that there was plenty of assessments and of these sanctions before they were implemented. And this sort of also is a segue into the second question by Mr. Papadimoulis, who had asked whether sanctions are sometimes a bit of a two-edged sword. And I guess he was particularly referring to the 8th sanctions package, which I think then he had in mind the oil price cap, I'm assuming. I want to say one thing there, and I guess this is also related to Mr. Rinaldi's question. Sometimes, so it is obviously true that sanctions do not only have an effect on the Russian economy, but also on the European economy. This is very much true. So in that sense, it is a two-edged sword. But sometimes you hear these stories or descriptions in the media, or people make these statements that sanctions hit ourselves harder than the Russian economy. I just want to be clear that in terms of the sanctions I've seen implemented so far, I think this is very far from reality for any of these sanctions. Any estimates of the effects of these sanctions, and again, there have been lots of impact assessments, are that the effects on the Russian economy are much stronger than on the European economies. I think a good rule of thumb is sort of something like an order of magnitude worse, like a factor of 5 or 10 worse. So, if you think GDP in Germany is going to drop by 1% because of the oil price cap, say, then you think that the effect on Russia will be 5% or something. So, I just want to sort of push back. And I mean, I'm not sure this is what you had in mind, but if anyone has in mind this idea that sanctions hit ourselves harder, then I think that's wrong. Mr. Eroglu also already said some of these things. I think the important thing is that we need to communicate exactly what each set of sanctions is doing. So I very much just wanted to agree with Mr. Eroglu's point there, and what we expect these effects to be, and we do need to be careful to be realistic, not to create unrealistic expectations. So yeah, that's important. Mr. Eroglu had also said something about this Morgan Stanley report, according to which then the Indian economy is growing a lot, and so then Russia may be able to sell a lot of energy to India instead. So I think there's definitely some truth to that. So, I was talking about adaptation and substitution that we see by European firms and households. I think the important thing to realize that it is true that this sort of adaptation and substitution cuts both ways, in the same way that the German or European economy is adapting. Also, the Russian economy is adapting, and yeah, of course, they're going to sell their oil elsewhere. But again, I do think that's still going to be the case, that our sanctions are going to hit them a lot harder than they're going to hit us. And then the second thing is, we need to then think about ways to prevent that. And I think, for example, this ban on insurance is a promising start. There's obviously still some holes in this, but this is a good start. Finally, on Mrs. Marcus's point, I think I just wanted to broadly agree with most of the things that were said. Yes, it's 100% extremely important to make sure that the energy war doesn't create in the social fabric falling apart and problems with industry. How do we do this? I think I've sort of already talked about this. So the key is to straddle this sort of balance between providing relief to both households and industry, and at the same time preserving incentives for saving energy. Again, I would highly encourage everyone to read this proposal of the German Gas Commission, which is really a very good proposal from the point of view of economic policy. And I think maybe can serve as a model for other countries, and hopefully the Germans will actually adopt that. Apart from that, also. I think if we need to, we have a social market economy, we have these social safety nets, and so we need to use them. And I would say in the case of Germany, for example,
Mr. Moll.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry if you can conclude, because I'm afraid we don't have that. May I ask you if you can share with us this proposal from the German Gas Commission? Because I didn't know about it. I think it would be interesting to take a look. We would be happy if you can share the document on the impact assessment. Just as a reminder for the colleagues, at the beginning of the war, we shared a lot of, it's true, there were many think tanks or economists that were publishing papers and articles about the assessment of the sanctions, and our former colleague Luis Garicano shared a lot of them back then. And I just recalled that if we had to wait for a formal assessment by the Commission, it would have taken months. And normally when you have a war, you want to reply in a shorter span of time. Also because if we had to take 7-8 months to respond to the war back then, we wouldn't be talking about Ukraine today, because we wouldn't have Ukraine anymore by now. So I give the floor to Maíra Martini.
Responding to Mr. Tang's questions, I would definitely agree that trusts are still a very important loophole. There is an opportunity now to try to address and increase transparency of trust and other legal arrangements. The Financial Action Task Force is currently reviewing the global standards, which means we can try to have stricter measures, including mandatory registration of trust. That's what we have been calling for, so that we ensure that other countries outside of the EU also implement stronger measures that then would impact, for example, the information that is available on assets owned by foreign trusts across the EU. On the Global Asset Register, I fully agree. I think what I meant before is some of the measures that are currently being discussed as part of the sixth directive would bring us closer to a Global Asset Register. But I fully agree that fully functional asset register would need to include all types of assets, including diamonds, art, and crypto assets, and we need to regulate those in countries where they're still not regulated. And importantly, this needs to be at the beneficial ownership level. So we want to know the natural persons holding those assets, those at the end of the chain and in control. And I would add here, just very briefly, that investment funds, so private equity and hedge funds, are not new from an unregulated market, but I think we also need to pay closer attention to those, because the current rules we have are not sufficient to have a good understanding of who the end investors are. So who are the individuals that are pulling money in those funds that are then used to own assets across the European Union. So paying more attention to that and making sure that we close existing loopholes so that we can know also how those assets are potentially being used to launder money. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to Dr. Swoboda.
The first question by Mr. Rinaldi for me is about the cryptocurrency and the crypto assets. I think this is the biggest issue we have on the financial and monetary markets, that more and more there is evading. There are criminal gangs and there are criminal countries who try to use cryptocurrencies for doing their bad job. And if we allow that, I'm not an expert how to prevent it, but if that allow that, then we can forget about sanctions, because everything will be done on the cryptocurrencies. To Mr. Papadimoulis, yes, I try to speak about the economic impact, especially on the inequality. Inflation is biting into the purse, into the money assets of especially of the poor people, with especially the food prices and so on. So what is important is, of course, to help financially, socially, social expenditure, but we have to get the inflation down, because inflation is also biting into our competitiveness in vis-a-vis to other countries and other regions, from the US to Asia. On your question about how the sanctions can go on, the difficulty is that if we would, and you mentioned any kind of ceasefire, whatever, any solution with the Putin regime brings the danger, and I understand the fear of the Ukrainians, that after some break he will start again. So we cannot say, okay, we stop the war and we lift the sanctions, because that is too easy. So we have to think about sanctions going on for a longer time. What is important, just to say about the sanctions and the effect on Europe. In Europe, of course, inflation is the big issue. But in Russia, it's the technological setback, the backward trend in Russia, which gives a very hard time for the Russian economy, at least in the medium and long term, if we prevent the technologies, passing by the sanctions and taking another way. So that's the important issue, to keep sanctions as long as the Putin regime is existing and there's no change in the whole attitude. I don't speak about regime change, about the attitude towards the neighborhoods and towards peace and stability in Europe. And that gives also me some question to what Madam Marquez said. We have to reach to the civil society. Therefore, with the sanctions on persons, we have to be very careful. We have to win over some of the second, third level elite who is more and more seeing that Putin is leading them in a totally wrong and destructive way. We have to have allies in Russia which can bring about a change in the political attitude. Therefore, yes, very much against for the sanctions and the assets control and whatever. But on our parallel thinking, Europe, especially Europe, America is not able to do that. Especially Europe must think who could take over after Mr. Putin. With whom can we have at least some talk? There will not be democracy like in the European Union countries. At least let's hope we can keep it. But we need some contact points in Russia itself with whom we can build for the future. Because Russia will not go away. We hope Putin will go away. His oligarchs will go away. But Russia will stay, and we need people with whom we can talk and with whom we can renew economic relationship on an equal basis, not depending on Russian gas and oil, and giving an economic basis for democracy. Yes, that's it.
Thank you. I'm sorry, but we are running a little bit late. Mr. Milovanov, our last speaker, you connected?
Thank you.
Yes.
I want to make a couple of remarks. One is about solution. There's in the background discussion of what could be a ceasefire, a peace solution. The key here is sustainable solution. And we also need to understand that the temporary solution to peace is basically means that the occupied territory, continuation of war crimes and torture of people. Sanctions, the purpose of sanctions actually is a military tool with the purpose to deny Russia in the future the aggressive military capability. So the alternative to sanctions are costly, but the alternative to sanctions are costlier. So as an economist, I would say when we talk about the cost of sanctions, we should look at the opportunity cost, and the opportunity cost is much higher. That, of course, creates pressure, political pressure, but here is where clear leadership is needed to explain that, of course, to support people, but to explain that the alternatives of wars. Finally, on reaching out to Russians, actually there are conversations with Russian opposition figures, and many of them are engaged in support of Ukraine in very direct, material way. These conversations are not public for obvious reasons. However, I think we should let Russians figure out for themselves what they want to be and how they want to live after this war, rather than try to create or build democracies there or do something else to reach out to some people and empower some people. That hasn't worked in the past, and that is not going to work themselves. Again, we need a sustainable solution with Russia, and they have to have their own reckoning and understanding. At the same time, I think we need to be very, very clear after the war that our job of the entire world is to ensure that Russia stops being aggressive military power. It's not our job to build a democracy there or find partners, but rather our job is to ensure that they don't pose a threat to neighboring countries and don't invade in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Milovanov. I think we all agree with that, and we really send you our best wishes. Stay safe, and you know that you have this house solidarity for your country. Thank you to all the speakers. We finish now our public hearing on sanctions, and I really thank again all the people who participated in the hearing. And now we have to move on to the next point in our agenda, which is the election of the second vice chair of this committee. Following the resignation on October 20th of Stephanie Yancourt-Tan as a second vice chair of the committee, we have to elect her successor. The substitutes taking part in the vote are Christoph Hansen, Eva Maibel, Fulvio Martuscello,